Information in war is weaponized. This is true for the United States, it is true for Israel, and it is true for Iran. But reading through the fog of war, the conflict with Iran does not appear to be going well for Israel or its U.S. ally. Iran's closing of the Strait of Hormuz and threats to mine the waterway is triggering the largest energy supply shock in decades. This energy crisis will only get worse. Iran has degraded the region's military infrastructure, taking out sophisticated U.S. radar stations in the Gulf and in Israel. This has left the U.S. and Israel increasingly unable to track incoming missiles and drones. Iran has carried out successful strikes on U.S. bases and ports, as well as energy infrastructure, desalination plants, and diplomatic compounds. The longer the war continues and Iran shows no signs that it is interested in negotiations, the more it erodes the security arrangements in the Gulf, ones built on the premise that America will protect the Gulf countries from Iran in the event of a conflict. The Trump administration has no clear goals for the war other than the unrealistic calls for unconditional surrender and bombastic threats. It has clearly made a terrible miscalculation about what the U.S. could achieve by killing the top leaders in Iran, including the supreme leader. This war, as it drags on, with no discernible exit strategy, has the potential to see the U.S. forced, as the global economy goes into crisis, to meet Iranian demands. This humiliating defeat would potentially mean the end of U.S. hegemony in the region. Joining me to discuss the war in Iran is Professor John Mearsheimer. He is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer, who graduated from West Point and was a captain in the Air Force, is the author of numerous books, including Conventional Deterrence, Nuclear Deterrence, Ethics, Lydell Hart and the Weight of History, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, and Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. Let's begin with this fact that the Pentagon for 3 decades has vigorously fought back against Israeli pressure to go to war with Iran, whether that was Obama, Bush, Biden, and for some reason, for all of the reasons, of course, that are now evident, the Pentagon didn't want this conflict. How was that reticence or resistance overcome?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, Chris, that none of Trump's predecessors took the bait when the Israelis tried to trap us into going to war against Iran. And you want to remember in 2024, Joe Biden's last year as president, the Israelis twice, once in April and then second in October of that year, tried to trap Biden into going to war against Iran. And he refused to do it. And Trump is the first president who fell into the trap. And of course, he did it last June during the 12-day war. You want to remember, in the 12-day war, the Israelis by themselves started that conflict on June 13th, and it ended on June 25th. But on June 22nd, we bombed 3 nuclear targets in Iran. But it was a one-day bombing. We talked about one and done at the time. And you remember that when the evening came on June 22nd, the bombing was finished, President Trump declared victory. So although he got involved for the first time, it only looked like he was putting his ankle in the water, that he wasn't becoming deeply committed to fighting a war in Iran. But that all changed on February 28th. The United States and Israel together, what I like to refer to as the tag team, decided to attack Iran. And we are now in a war of attrition with the Iranians, in which case it's hard to see how this war ends. So Trump took the bait. And I think, to put it in more specific terms, I think basically that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been working overtime for decades now, literally decades, to get the United States to attack Iran for Israel finally succeeded with Trump. As I said,
Hello, what's up, everyone? How are you doing? I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter Eugene Docu Stories. There's something that I want to share with you, brothers and sisters. There's a video that I found on the channels of Chris Edge. Chris Edge is an American, I'll say American lawyer who focuses on talking about political things that are happening in the United States. Is being one of the greatest Trump critics since he got into power, and majority of the things that he has always been trying to warn Americans about Trump came to happen. And in this video, we are seeing him hosting John Mashema, giving reports on why he thinks that America is going to lose this war with Iran. Remember, this is something that has been going on for a week now. We have been, not a week, but somewhere close to three weeks. This has been happening for around now. But there are key pointers. There are key things that he says about the United States. Remember, Chris Edges have been one of the biggest American critics, and he has always been trying to warn Americans about the following that will happen. And according to he says, he definitely says that the United States, generally America, is going to lose this war early in the morning, especially when we are seeing as the truth keeps on unraveling. And here's an important message, especially John Mashema. He has an important message to share with black people and the entire America. So brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video, and then I'll be back. I'll be sharing my 2 cents in regards to this. At the end of the day, we have to learn, because Trump is becoming a global menace. Trump is becoming a global menace and is making everyone question his, moves. Is making everyone question the text. The things that he's doing right now. Probably is that one person that acts out of impulse. So people are questioning a couple of things, because it is evident that this war with Iran is going to lose. Because already, as what we are seeing, definitely we are seeing Iran still steps ahead away from America. So brothers and sisters, let's watch the video. I'll be back.
there was a tiny step taken forward in that regard last June, but now Trump has jumped full body into the water.
And yet you see, even with this sycophantic head of the Joint Chiefs, Kane, every time he's trotted out in front of the cameras, he doesn't look very happy. I think the military foresaw, the Pentagon foresaw what is coming, and is quite perplexed about how to deal with it.
I think that General Kane has actually behaved quite well here. You want to remember that when Trump came into office January of last year, January 2025, he fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, and he brought General Kane out of retirement. Kane was only a 3-star general. He wasn't even a 4-star general. But Trump liked him, and Trump made him a 4-star general, and he made him the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, given that he was in effect Trump's general, that he owed his position to Donald Trump, you would think that he would tell Donald Trump what he wanted to hear about going to war against Iran. But on the contrary, what Kane did before the war, this is before February 28th, was he made it very clear to President Trump that we did not have a viable military option. So when you say that General Kane, every time he's trotted out, looks very uncomfortable, I think that's true. And I think there's a simple explanation for why he looks so uncomfortable. He knew from the get-go that this one was not going to work out the way Trump and Netanyahu thought that it was going to work out. And he understands that he is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was the chairman when we entered this foolish war on February 28th, despite the fact that he had warned against it.
Is it too simplistic to say that Trump and Netanyahu naively believed that by taking out the supreme leader and some of the hierarchy, there would be regime change and the war would be over?
I think that's clearly the case with Trump. I think that that was the argument that Netanyahu sold to Trump, and Trump liked the argument. I think given what happened in Venezuela, he thought that we had the ability to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And when Bibi told him that the regime in Iran is weak and all we have to do is decapitate it and really hit hard on that first day or two, that the regime would crumble and we would end up with a pro-American, pro-Israeli regime in its place. I think Netanyahu was very successful at telling Trump that story. And Trump is not exactly surrounded by wise advisors, save for General Kane, who would tell him otherwise. So he fell into the trap. Now, Netanyahu's a more complicated case. One could argue that Netanyahu understood that a decapitation strike wouldn't work, that this would not be a quick and decisive victory, and that instead what he was trying to do was trap Trump into a long war, in which case Iran would be destroyed. In other words, Netanyahu understood that the regime would not fall quickly, but once we committed to fighting the war, we would have no choice but to see it through. And that's the situation that we're in now. So that's a possible argument. It's hard to know for sure whether it's true, but it's also possible, just having watched Netanyahu over time, that he too bamboozled himself into believing that the Iranian regime was fragile and that we could easily affect regime change. You know, he's been saying that for a long time, as you well know, Chris. And sometimes when people repeat particular arguments, after a while, they even begin to believe their own arguments, although they initially did not. So it's possible that Bibi fooled himself, or it's possible that he was just tricking Trump into getting into this war.
Well, the Israeli goal is different from the American goal. The Americans want regime change. The Israelis want to create a failed state. They want to fragment Iran the same way they fragmented and destroyed Iraq, the same way they turned Libya into a failed state. Those are very different goals.
I agree with that. But the Israelis don't advertise that fact. I think the Israeli view is if they got regime change and they got a pro-American / pro-Israel regime in place, that then they wouldn't have to worry that much about destroying the country. But I think that they probably understand that that's not going to happen, that Iran's not going away. And given that Iran is not going away, let's wreck it. Let's do to Iran what we did to Syria. And then we're done with Iran. We can turn to Turkey and break Turkey apart as well.
Well, let's talk about a country that does have a strategy, which is in the United States, and that's Iran. And what I found interesting is that rather than confront the American military might, i.e. the ships, and they have decided quite astutely and quite methodically to destroy the economic machinery, not only in the Gulf, but globally.
Yeah, the Iranians are pursuing a smart strategy. And to go back to General Kane has made a number of comments about the Iranians that make clear that he respects their ability to strategize in this war. He is not contemptuous of the Iranians. When you listen to Hegseth and Trump talk, they talk about the Iranians like they're a bunch of country bumpkins and we're the strategic geniuses. And not only do we have an advantage in material power, we Americans have an advantage in how to think strategically. I think that's not the case. And I think if you listen carefully to General Kane, he's making that point. We are up against a formidable adversary. Given what you said, given what General Kane said, they have a lot of cards to play. The key here, Chris, is that Iran has a huge arsenal of short-range ballistic missiles and drones that it can use against the Gulf states. And the Gulf states present a target-rich environment. It's easy to use those drones and those short-range ballistic missiles to do great damage to all of the countries in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia. The Iranians also have a lot of long-range missiles and also long-range drones that can hit Israel. Now, they've not done much of that up to now. It's very important to understand that in the 12-day war last June, the Iranians fought almost exclusively against Israel. They did not target American military bases in the region, and they did not target the Gulf states. In this war, they're targeting Israel, American military installations in the region, and the Gulf states. And in the first part of the war, up to pretty much now, they've concentrated mainly on attacking American installations and attacking the Gulf states. But they have announced that they are now beginning to switch the focus, and they're going to concentrate much more on attacking Israel. And they have the long-range ballistic missiles, and they have drones, which they can use to hit Israel. And the problem that the Israelis face, and of course this is a problem that the Americans face, is that we only have a finite number of defensive missiles that can be used to shoot down those incoming ballistic missiles. And even when we use those defensive missiles, they oftentimes don't hit the incoming Iranian ballistic missile. So we have this situation in the Gulf and in Israel where the Iranians have the capability to pound all of those countries for a long period of time. And there's nothing we can do about it. And in fact, as time goes by, our ability to shoot down those missiles, shoot down the drones, decreases. It doesn't flatline, and it certainly doesn't increase. It decreases. So the Iranians have a serious set of military options against us. And what this means, Chris, is that as we walk up the escalation ladder, and that's what we're likely to do if we can't find an off-ramp, and I don't think we're going to find an off-ramp. If we don't find an off-ramp, I think what we'll do is march up the escalation ladder. And of course, Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump will say we have escalation dominance as you go up that escalation ladder. But I don't think that's true. I think the Iranians have powerful cards to play. And therefore, we are in a really terrible situation.
What does that escalation ladder look like? What will that mean? They're already carrying out virtually saturation bombing of Tehran.
Not yet. They're pounding Iran. There's no question about that. And they're pounding Tehran. But they have not killed more than 1,500 people. I mean, it's terribly regrettable that they've even killed one person, much less 1,500 or whatever the number is. But they have not gone that far. The Israelis and the Americans have not gone that far up the escalation ladder. And in a very important way, there's evidence that the Americans are discouraging the Israelis for going too far and too fast up the escalation ladder, because we understand that the Iranians have a second strike capability. The Israelis don't care that much because the Israelis want to see us get deeply involved in this war and destroy Iran. They'd like us to level every city in Iran, break the country apart. But Trump does not, at this point, want to go down that road. But I think what happens here, Chris, as we march up the escalation ladder, is that we target civilian areas. We end up killing larger and larger numbers of people. And furthermore, we begin to flirt with the idea of tearing apart Iran's petroleum infrastructure and maybe their desalination plants as well. We begin to really try to throttle the regime, to strangle it. And again, this involves not just simply killing people, which I think if you get desperate enough, you'll do. The Israelis, of course, would have no problem doing that. And ultimately, I think if we got desperate enough, we would not either. But again, the problem is we do those things, the Iranians will retaliate. If we go after energy infrastructure in Iran, the Iranians will go after more and more energy infrastructure in the Gulf, in Gulf states. If we go after desalination plants, they'll go after desalination plants in places like Saudi Arabia and Israel itself. I think the Israelis have 4 or 5 big desalination plants that they depend heavily on. And I think the Iranians will be incentivized to take them out if we, or the Israelis, or both of us go after their desalination plants. So you can see that as we go up the escalation ladder, the Iranians will go up with us. And I don't see how you can make the case that we have escalation dominance in any meaningful way, especially when you take into account the fact that the historical record is quite clear here that countries can suffer enormous amounts of punishment in these sorts of air campaigns, and the population does not rise up against the government and overthrow it. And in fact, what happens in most of those cases, if not all those cases, is that the population rallies around the flag. So if we think, or the Israelis think, that killing Iranian civilians is going to put pressure on the government to quit the war, I think that is erroneous thinking.
Well, we tried that in Vietnam.
We tried it in Korea. If you ever look at what we did to North Korea during the Korean War, it's horrific. It's much worse than what we did in Vietnam. And then you go back to World War I, World War II. Excuse me, not World War I, World War II in Europe and World War II in East Asia against Japan. I mean, the number of people that we killed is just hard to believe. But it's very hard, if not impossible, to get, those air campaigns to cause a government to quit.
Well, is there an example of an air campaign that does break a government? I don't think so, historically, is there?
No, I think the only case you could make is the dropping 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th got the Japanese to finally quit. The Japanese were at the edge of the cliff by August of 1945. And the question is what pushed them off the cliff? And some people would argue it was the 2 nuclear weapons on those 2 dates. I actually think that's not true. I think it was when the Russians came in on August 8th. Remember, the war in Europe is won on May 8th, 1945. And at Yalta, the Russians or the Soviets had said that they would come in 3 months after the war in Europe ended. In other words, they would come into the war against Japan 3 months after the war in Europe ended. And the war in Europe ends on May 8th, 1945. And 3 months later, on August 8th, 1945, the Soviets invade against the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria and quickly overrun it. I believe that it's the Soviet decision to attack Japan on August 8th, which is in between the 2 bombs on August 6th and August 9th, that is the critical factor that gets the Japanese to throw up their hands. But that's the only case you can make where one could say that air power helped a bit to end the war. But just quickly, Chris, on that case, because it's important to understand it, we start firebombing Japan on the evening of March 10th, 11th, 1945. And the first night that we firebomb Tokyo, this is March 10th, we kill more Japanese than are killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Just think about that. That's the first night we firebomb Tokyo. And then we're working our way down the list of large Japanese cities and firebombing them, murdering huge numbers of people. Just truly remarkable. And the Japanese don't quit. They don't quit until August. And that, of course, is when the 2 nuclear weapons are dropped and the Soviets come into the war. And that's sort of the coup de grace. But firebombing just didn't work. And it supports the basic point that I'm making, that you can murder, and this is really murder because you're purposely targeting civilians. You can murder huge numbers of civilians, and it doesn't work. The historical record is remarkably clear on this. And here we are in Iran. We're not going to send ground forces in, right? We're going to rely on air power. We're going to bomb, and we're going to bomb Iran and win the war. We're going to create regime change without sending ground forces in. Just going to do it through the air. The historical record makes it unequivocally clear that this is almost impossible to do. Absent a miracle, and I don't believe in miracles, it's hard to get regime change, or impossible to get regime change using air power alone. You got to send boots. You got to put boots on the ground. This is what we did in Iraq. We had to invade Iraq to get regime change. And if you want regime change in Iran, you're going to have to invade that country. And that's not going to happen. Country is much too big. There are too many people. And furthermore, we've been there before. It doesn't work very well. And even Donald Trump is smart enough to know that sending an army into Iran would be a real prescription for disaster.
Let's talk about the economic impact of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, and just on the issue of desalination plants. Having worked in Saudi Arabia, you take these out, you have a huge humanitarian crisis. I mean, cities like Riyadh are almost completely dependent on desalination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the administration, the Trump administration, has told the Israelis to stay away from desalination plants. And we do not want to get into a war where both sides are attempting to destroy the desalination plants on each side. This would not be good because, as you say, it would be catastrophic disaster for the people in all of those countries in the Gulf region. And I believe it would have devastating effects inside Israel as well if the Iranians were able to take out those 4 or 5 desalination plants that the Israelis have. So I think that, for the time being anyway, we'll stay away from that. The economic consequences, have not been fully felt yet. And we'll see what happens with the passage of time. Very interestingly, the Iranians are still shipping oil out of the Gulf. Needless to say, Iranian tankers or tankers carrying Iranian oil are not going to be sunk by the Iranians, and they can make their way through the Straits of Hormuz. So the Iranians are still selling oil.
Which I think 80% of their seaborne oil goes to China. Is that correct?
I think that's right, yeah. But I think that if you look at China's present situation in terms of, how much oil it has in reserve, where it gets its additional oil from, China is not going to be hurt that much, at least initially, if the oil is cut off. It's Japan and South Korea that are going to be clobbered. Japan and South Korea are more dependent on oil coming out of the Gulf than the Chinese are. It's quite interesting here, Chris, but if you think about it, the Europeans are really going to be hurt badly if the oil is cut off for a sustained period of time. And you want to remember, the Europeans are already in trouble because they're not getting oil and gas in the way they used to from Russia. And now they're depending more on the United States and the Middle East. So if you cut off the flow of oil and gas from the Middle East to Europe, on top of the fact that all that oil and gas coming out of Russia has been curtailed, you can see with the European economies, which are already struggling, are going to be even in more trouble. So Europe is going to be hurt. It looks like Japan and South Korea are going to be hurt. And then there are countries, that are less developed, like Nigeria, that are going to pay a real price as a result of what's happening here. So the economic consequences, which are just beginning to be felt, could be significantly worse. And the consequences of this for the world economy could be catastrophic. And of course, the Trump administration fully understands that. They understand that, to some extent, it's hard to predict exactly how this plays out, but they surely understand that you can tell plausible stories as to how this ends up being one giant nightmare. Again, it's not to say that will happen, but you can tell plausible stories about how this becomes a nightmare. We go far enough up the escalation ladder, and the Iranians really go after the Gulf states and really go to great lengths to destroy their oil infrastructure and gas infrastructure. The consequences could be disastrous for everyone on the planet. And the Trump administration understands that. They don't want to take any chances here. This is why you see evidence that the Trump administration is looking for an off-ramp.
Well, the Iranians aren't going to give it to them, are they?
They'd be crazy to give it to them unless they get a good deal. You hardly see any talk about this in the mainstream media, but all of the talk revolving around the question of an off-ramp and ending this war has to do with how we think we fared in the end and how we think the Israelis fared in the end. In other words, the Israelis are fearful that if we cut a deal now without regime change or without destroying Iran, this will be a victory for Iran, and the Americans might be happy, but we're not happy. And President Trump and his people are thinking that given that we have the midterm elections coming up, the war is not going well, we have to end it. And even if we don't have a decisive victory, so be it. It's just important that we get this war put to bed and declare victory and then start worrying about the election in November. That's the way the discourse is evolving in the West. But nobody seems to understand that to get the Iranians to quit, you have to offer them a deal that they find acceptable, because they're in the driver's seat now. The war is playing to their advantage. They've figured out that they have leverage over the United States and over Israel. The fact that they have all these ballistic missiles and all these drones, and they're operating in a target-rich environment. They understand that they don't want to quit here, right? They want to use this capability to give them leverage. Now you say to yourself, leverage for what? Leverage to get a deal at the end of this conflict, to get some sort of arrangement put in place that leaves them much better off than they were before February 28th. So what exactly does that mean? First of all, they're going to want sanctions relief. They're going to want major sanctions relief. They're probably going to want reparations. And they're probably going to want some sort of arrangement that guarantees that the Israelis and the Americans can't pay them a return visit in 6 months or a year. Remember, last June, there was a war against Iran. And here we are in March with another war against Iran. This is, in less than 1 year, Iran has been attacked 2 times by the tag team. They don't want a third war. And the question is, how can they prevent a third war? How can they get these sanctions finally taken off of Iran? These are issues that they care greatly about. And when they negotiate an armistice or a peace agreement or some sort of deal to put an end to this war, they're going to have demands. And we're going to have to meet those demands. And if we don't meet those demands, they have an incentive to continue upping the ante until we do agree to certain of those demands. And this is why I say it's hard to see where the United States has a clear off-ramp today, because it's not just getting the Israelis on board with quitting this war. You have to work out a deal with the Iranians. And given the balance of what looks like the balance of power now between Iran on one side and the United States and the Israelis on the other side, in terms of the conduct of the war, they have no incentive to quit. They should continue to fight.
Let's talk about the consequences. Let's say this does become protracted weeks, months, you use the word catastrophic. Paint a picture of what the global economy could look like.
Well, you could have a worldwide depression. You could have something less than that, like a worldwide recession that would have huge consequences for people all over the planet, especially in developing countries. Less so in developed countries, but even in developed countries, it's quite clear that the importance of oil for running the international economy simply can't be underestimated. You know, it's very interesting, but for people who study grand strategy like I do, and you talk about what areas of the world matter to the United States, where are our vital interests at stake? Almost everybody says that outside of the Western Hemisphere, East Asia and Europe matter enormously, and they have both mattered enormously over time because that's where the other great powers are. But then the question is, why does the Persian Gulf, not the Middle East, but the Persian Gulf, why is the Persian Gulf considered to be the third most important or the third important strategic area? You can understand East Asia and you can understand Europe because that's where the great powers are. But why the Persian Gulf? And the answer, of course, is not because there's any great power in the Persian Gulf. There is not. It's because that's where the oil is. And we have long understood the centrality of oil, this natural resource, for fueling the international economy. And if something went catastrophically wrong with the flow of oil coming out of the Middle East, this would have disastrous consequences for the international economy. We've long understood this, and this is why we consider the Persian Gulf to be a vital strategic interest. All of that tells you that if this war plays out in ways that you have a serious cutoff of the flow of oil out of the Gulf, or it's almost completely cut off, this will have disastrous consequences for the international economy. And it won't be just a case of not being able to get gas for your car at a reasonable price. That'll be the least of our problems. The fact is that if you cut off the flow of oil from the Gulf, the effects of that will ripple throughout the economy. It will have a tremendous effect on the industrial base as a whole. It will have a tremendous effect on the cost of electricity. Inflation will go through the roof. Production will be curtailed in serious ways. As I said, you could be in a global recession.
Hello, what's up everyone? How are you doing? I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching this video. Again, I'm your host and pray Zenta Stories. A lot has been said about Mr. Donald Trump because he is a global menace. He is a global menace because everyone kept on questioning his moves. Everyone kept on questioning everything that he's saying. Majority of people that watched this video definitely had something to say about the United States. And somebody said that it may be dangerous to be American enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. That's according to Henry Kissinger. Yes. Somebody also said that Israel had been looking for a stupid US president for 40 years. Finally, they found one in Trump. And you'll know what is going on between the United States and Israel. American citizens are not happy about what the US president is doing with American Prime Minister. Israel Prime Minister, that's Netanyahu. All of these things that have been going on right now, we are seeing people are not appreciating it. People are not happy. Somebody's saying that as an American patriot, I think Iran humiliating the United States is the only thing that can save this country. Yeah. Because American citizens are behind Iran. They are supporting Iran full time because they cannot trust their own country. They cannot trust their own continent. Like America itself is so done. It's so done, and everyone is looking up to this war. And everyone is saying Iran putting a stop to what Israel and the United States is doing. Somebody is saying that our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate, is weak and ineffective. Is that really a false? Because all I'm saying is truth. People are saying truth. Somebody said that Iran won't accept any deals offered by America or Israel. Both have launched attacks on Iran during negotiations, and it was Trump who terminated the JCPOA. There is no trust left. There is no trust left for these folks. Somebody saying that here in Europe, we are going crazy. In any case, support for the genocidal Israel on the highway to war with our Russian neighbors, support for US in their war for aggression with Iran. Only Spain is an exemption. Viva España, Europe on highway to hell. The entire Europe is on highway to hell. That's not a lie. Somebody said that humans are utterly despicable species. How is it that a country and people so humiliated by the Nazis is now applying tactics and ambitions that resemble the ones used against them? Instead of showing the world understanding and compassion from the lessons learned, they simply repeat the cycle of hate. Somebody's also saying that China is streets ahead of the USA with renewable energy and is Australia's biggest trading partner. I'm an oldie and I am so sick of the USA and all the wars. So somebody also came and said that given the current environment of heightened propaganda, gaslighting, and obfuscation from official sources, we are fortunate to have independent voices like John Mashima to provide truthful, unbiased information. Thank you for having him on this program. Okay. Someone also came and said that we in the US have been coasting on this idealized vision of the US military and basking in the greatest generation, glory of D-Day. But since then, there has been mostly just a long string of atrocities. Japan, firebombing and nuclear bombs, civilians massacres in Korea and Vietnam, Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, and now Iranian schoolgirls. Not sure why we never learned to mind our own damn businesses, as most of these misplaced adventures have turned things to shit. Killing, such as the deaths of 175 schoolgirls, 125 sailors, Iranian officials, scientists, and the shooting down and killing of Iranian passengers plane 747 and many other killings have raised deep concerns and anger among the Iranians. These events deserve transparent international investigation and accountability. Lies, lies, lies. Somebody said that that men do not learn very much from the lessons of our history is the most important of all lessons of history. Aldous Huxley. Somebody said that Charlie Kirk lobbied Trump hard to not go to war with Iran last summer. A few months last, Charlie Kirk was dead, and suddenly Trump was convinced by Netanyahu, his billionaires, donors, and Fox News. Or somebody said that Trump clearly calculated that this offensive would be a Venezuela 2.0, a quick show of might to distract from a fading economy and the Epstein files. They hopelessly misjudged the scale and aggression of Iranians' response. Yeah, it's real true that all we are seeing happening right now. So I really want to know, because this is what people shared, and I really wanted to share with you so that you get to hear what people shared and really tell me what you feel about this in the comment section. Right, as you know, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories, but until then, I'm hoping to see you on my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.